The countdown is on to the first presidential debate, and both candidates are working to fine-tune their messages with just 1 week to go from today. President Biden now is heading to Camp David tonight to huddle with advisors, and former President Trump is holding a series of private meetings with senators, policy experts, and other allies. And the debate stage will only have 2 podiums officially. RFK Jr. has failed to qualify. The independent candidate did not meet CNN's ballot and polling thresholds for that June 27th debate. So let's bring in our own debate watchers, Bob Costa and Weijia Jiang, joining us here. Weijia, I want to start with you at the White House because, as we mentioned, the president is preparing to go to Camp David tonight. What more can you tell us about how he's preparing? What are his plans there?
Well, Caitlin, we expect that he will be there for several days, huddled with his closest advisors, everyone from his chief of staff to members of his speech writing team, because this is not just about debating Donald Trump. This is about making sure his message has broken through. Back in 2020, of course, on the debate stage, at center stage was Trump's record. And now it's Biden's, which, of course, Trump will try to attack. But the campaign really sees this as an opportunity to remind voters of everything the president has accomplished under his watch in the past nearly 4 years. And so, sure, there will be a lot of preparation for mapping out what they anticipate to hear from Trump, but they'll also be preparing what they want to get across on their own, on the offensive. And so this is going to be really intense debate sessions, much like we saw in 2020, everything from planning sessions to actually practicing with somebody who will ultimately stand in for the former President Trump, who we don't know who that is quite yet, but there will be that sort of role playing so that President Biden can anticipate everything.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see who they choose to play Donald Trump there this year. Bob, Weijia was mentioning that President Biden is kind of looking to go on the offense here and try to use this as kind of a platform to talk about his policies. How is Donald Trump thinking about this debate? He likes to say that he doesn't need the kind of preparation that the Biden team is talking about. But how do you think he's looking at this?
There's so much discussion about style, personality, mute buttons. But when I'm talking to my top sources close to President Biden and also those close to former President Trump, it's evident that this debate is seen by both campaigns as an opportunity for their respective candidates to make a real appeal to working voters across the country. Just yesterday, at America Decides, we spoke to Senator Bernie Sanders, who's in Ohio today, making his pitch on the minimum wage. You're going to see at the debate, I'm told by sources, overtures to working voters nationwide. From Trump talking about getting rid of any kind of taxation on tips for employees who are working jobs like at a Las Vegas restaurant or a casino or any restaurant nationwide. And from President Biden, you're going to hear an emphasis on his many trips to Detroit and Philadelphia, his support of the UAW and labor unions nationwide. You're going to hear about the American Rescue Plan. You're going to hear about all the efforts to provide more infrastructure in this country. It's a battle of who is really standing there for the worker, who is seen as kind of anti-establishment, even though they're titans of their own political establishments, who's there in the trenches with the workers as they deal with all of the turbulence in the American economy. Because so many workers, when we're out there on the campaign trail, they know the stock market's at a record high. People who have investments feel pretty good, but those who don't have major investments are still feeling that inflationary pain, and they want to see who's a fighter.
Yeah, and even as they know who these 2 candidates are, this is such a group that's up for grabs. And I'm glad you mentioned the tips, because we're going to be talking with Ed O'Keefe, who was just in Las Vegas later this hour. Weijia, let's talk a little bit about those kind of ground rules that Bob was alluding to there. They include muting microphones and some other items. How is the Biden team kind of thinking about that, if at all, in terms of the rules as they plot their strategy here?
Well, CNN, which is, of course, hosting the debate, actually reported just today that the Biden camp won the coin toss that will determine a couple things. It will determine the order of who gets to make the closing argument and where these 2 candidates will be physically standing on the stage. And so the Biden campaign chose to decide about that location. And so President Biden will be to the right of the podium, and that's going to impact how viewers see him on their screen. And that means that former President Trump, I should say, will get the last word in the closing argument. And so that was a strategic decision made on the part of the Biden campaign. And as you mentioned, in terms of the muted microphones, the fact that there will be no audience participation, these are designed to really allow the viewers who are consuming this at home to focus on each candidate and what they are saying. As you know very well, in past debates, especially when these two men faced off before, there was a little bit of a circus-like atmosphere. There was a lot of interruptions and cheers, just like you would expect at any live event. So these rules really allow the viewer to hone in on the words coming out of each candidate's mouth.
Yeah, and Weijia, you mentioned each candidate there. Two candidates, Bob, RFK Jr., as we mentioned, will not be on the debate stage officially. What do you make of that kind of absence? And were either campaigns really focused on him anyway?
RFK Jr. will not be on the debate stage, but you can expect him to have a presence there, politically speaking. Both the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign know that there are many voters nationwide who have grievances about the economy. They feel a bit paranoid about the country, especially after the pandemic. There is anxiety among many voters in certain states about vaccine mandates. RFK Jr. has not generated enormous traction with his campaign, but he's generated some traction and been able to get on the ballot in certain states. They're not going to maybe mention Robert F. Kennedy Jr. by name, but they know they need to reach voters who might be traditionally so-called non-voters, people who don't participate in the political process, aren't well informed about the policy positions of Trump and Biden. And how can they make a real appeal to people who might never tune into politics, be a little bit intrigued by RFK Jr.'s name, his anti-establishment persona? How can they try to win some of those voters over? Because those voters in a close race in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin could be crucial.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly about those margins. And I was recently in Arizona where that margin was just 10,000 votes last time around, and talking to some voters who don't like either candidate and saw RFK Jr. as at least someone to vote for. So we'll see whether and how he addresses, either candidate addresses them. The other kind of looming issue over Biden over the past week or so, Weijia, has been his son Hunter, of course, now convicted in Delaware recently. Do you know if the campaign is expecting to kind of field attacks from former President Trump on his son?
So in other words, is the former president planning to attack Hunter Biden? And what we've seen already, Caitlin, is a real drawback from that compared to 2020. Even when Hunter Biden was just convicted a couple weeks ago, he was mum about it, even though they sent out a statement that was pretty vague and not directly attacking Hunter Biden, because I think they realized how it backfired, because you're talking about somebody's son. And so on the flip side of that, the Biden team believes that, they've handled this exactly how they wanted to, which was to stress that this is not the president who was convicted. It is his son. So then they believe the question becomes, how has President Biden dealt with this as a father? And they believe that he has shown support. Every chance they get, they try to connect with the American public to say, you guys know what this is like. I'm sure you know somebody who's struggled with addiction, who has struggled with something comparable to this. And so they've really tried to show the empathy from President Biden. And by the way, Caitlin, the other big difference between now and back then, when Trump was attacking Hunter Biden almost every other sentence, which is that, Trump himself is now a convicted felon. And so he probably doesn't want to draw more attention to that, even though I imagine President Biden will be doing that quite a bit.
Yeah, that's notable, Weijia, especially since we've seen a new ad from the Biden team pointing out that their opponent is a convicted felon. Very interesting reporting. Look forward to both of you continuing that next week. Bob and Weijia, thank you so much.